Parveen. I work as okay, thank you. My name is Parveen. I work as a professor of nursing and professor of gender-based violence at the University of Sheffield and Doncaster Bassett Law Teaching Hospitals. These workshops are around different topics on related to writing and writing for publications we do every month. And the idea behind this is to my job role at DBTH is around capacity building of research among nurses, midwife, and allied health professionals. And these workshops serve different purposes. One is like it allows us to connect to people and help answer those questions that they have, provide support, tell them what kind of support is available for people to their writing journey or their research journey or their career development, and what is it which they can do going forward, where can they seek help, and how can they progress basically in their own sort of career and chosen path. This particular workshop today, who are you writing it for, or who are we writing it for? The idea came from that when we talk to different people, this notion always comes in, and I've seen it in play it up quite differently in various different contexts. So as I say, I work as professor here. I work within the university, so I have been teaching students from undergraduate to PhD level. So which then means that you read through the assignments and documents which they have written at different levels of study they're on, and you see how they progress from one point to next, and how their writing journey begins, what sort of problems people have at different levels. I'm editor-in-chief of International Nursing Review, which is a Wiley-based journal, the official journal of International Council of Nurses. And in that capacity, I see a lot of articles submitted by different people, which go through the whole process of reviewing. Some of them are successful, some of them are not successful, but you see a constant theme in terms of, people sometimes struggling as to who do you write it for. And then if you get anyone in between, like, for example, PhD students and those who are starting to write or learning to write, that particular group. And this thing about how do you start thinking about your audience, people may not always think through this earlier on. So that's where the idea for this particular aspects came from. When it comes to writing, these days, there are quite a lot of avenues. So I think that adds to another dimension. Writing keeps on changing depending on the era that we live in, depending on the context in which we practice, the language that people are using, people who are writing and people who are reading. And then also the avenues which are available. So I think there are quite a lot of pressures around writing and how should you write. And I'm not entirely sure if as a writer, we are always aware of that, or we often think through things if the audience matter. So that's where the idea of this particular workshop has come from. So you may have joined for various different reasons. So in the chat box, Sarah has shared a link to an answer garden in which just write your role. And that is there because we use that sort of information every time we do this workshop. And the idea is that we don't want to know anything about other details, but it will allow us to see who our audience are. Yeah. So who is coming to our workshop so that we can see that we are meeting their needs, or do we need to tailor our language or other aspects slightly to just make sure that it's inclusive and we're not talking about one particular group on one or not the other. So I will shut up here and I'll ask Sarah to introduce herself and to give us a little bit about her, and then we can just take it on from there. Sarah?
Thanks, Parveen. I'm Sarah Gardner. I'm the clinical evidence specialist for Doncaster and Bassett Law, working in the Knowledge and Library Service. So we support research throughout the Trust in a variety of ways. So from database skills training, critical appraisal of quantitative research, and a variety of other things. So I'm going to park our webpage in the chat, because we have supporting research web pages with lots and lots of information and something very specific for writing for publication. So please do check that out if you haven't already. And if you belong to the trust and you need anything in terms of skills brushing up in the database searching, or just come and find me, talk to me, and let's see how I can help you.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. So in terms of our audience, it's interesting. So Kate is interested in doing applying for a sociological PhD. That's interesting. So we're going to, if it's okay, I'm just going to ask a few questions, if that's okay with you, Kate. Richard is a scientist, and who else have we got? We've got new people here. We have got Safira. Do you mind introducing yourself and tell us a little bit about your interest in writing?
Hello, my name is Shafira. I am an Ops and Gynae specialty registrar, currently working at Doncaster Hospital. I'm here because, well, I'm not on call and I have time to attend an educational session. And basically, I just want to learn as much as possible about publication.
How do I pronounce your name?
It's Shafira.
Shafira. Thank you,
Yeah,
Shafira. Thanks
thank
a lot. Thank you. And Kate, her mic is not working, so she's introduced herself. So thank you. There was somebody else who joined, and then they've gone back. So yeah. So thank you everybody who's joined. So and all of you have been writing. What's your Richard? You've mentioned that you're writing for different audience. What do you write it for? Do you write blogs? Do you write scientific articles? What do you do?
Well, I've done a lot of publications while I was doing my PhD, but a lot of that is a long time ago now. So I could be writing stuff that's going to go in the Trust's Facebook page, trying to get some changes to the way samples are being sent in, that sort of thing. I could be writing even just comments on the laboratory system that hopefully people see in the results, stuff like that. And it's quite often a case of trying to get across fairly technical stuff that people may or may not be aware of, and hopefully without either talking down to those who really don't understand it and don't have a scientific background, and without being too wordy for those who do know it, and it's that stuff they already recognize but don't realize applies to that particular patient or that particular situation.
Thank you. Yes. And Safira, who do you write it for? Do you write it, or are you thinking about it?
I'm in the process of, I have some publications, but just basically I've not yet been involved. I mean, I'm currently writing a manuscript for publication of a case report that is still awaiting approval by the supervisor. But the other publications that I've done, I've not really been the first author before. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And I think one of the things that you would realize that the generation or the time that we are in, perhaps we are writing more than we think we are writing. Would you agree with that? Okay, so Kate has written that she's written the stats element of a published article, and she's written nursing articles not yet published. But in the last year, I've started writing sociological articles dissertation as I'm moving into that area. And she started in stump biology, which is very different to nursing and sociology. Yeah, thank you. So what I was saying is that I think we write more than what our previous generations were writing for. The reason I'm saying this, that, there are quite a lot of medias available, but the amount of information that is available, usually it is either in the written form or it's in the form of audio or videos. But even to produce those audios or videos, people have to write scripts and everything else. And usually there are transcripts available. So sometimes people, now there is automated generation, but a little time ago from this, and even many people do write the whole script and upload that in a way with their videos. So we with the advent, there was a time when people used to write letters only and send it to other people through post and stuff. Now email is a regular thing, so we write emails regularly, text messages, normal text messages. Then we have got messages on the WhatsApp. Then we have got Facebook. Then we have got different media channels. And if you look at how information is presented on various different channels, if you look at, for example, Facebook or Instagram or Twitter and now TikTok, you would see that the way things are written or communicated are slightly different on each of those platforms. So they have got various a little idiosyncrasies of their own places wherever those information is presented. If we talk about more sort of academic or writing type of thing, so if you're writing courses, the language is different. If you're writing a blog, the language is different. If you're writing a journal article, the language is different. As Richard was saying, if you're writing, depending on who your audience are, the language is very different. If you're going to write a tweet or a Facebook post or something else, the language is different depending on what we are writing it for. And we do not always usually pay attention to these things. And one of the things which I usually suggest to my students in my capacity of being a lecturer or as an editor is that always think about your audience as who is it that you're writing it for. If you're a student, you probably are writing it for your tutor or the person and who is going to mark your assignment. And the idea is to give information as much as to them for them to assess that your learning has taken place. If you're writing for a scientific journal, your idea is to provide information about the method, about the experiment, or about the research that you have done, or the project that you have completed, or your thoughts about something in a way that it is understandable to those audience. Now, depending on which journal are you writing for, you may be writing it for people in your own profession and or people outside your profession or general public. So there are various different places where you will try and present the same information in a very different shape or form. Again, if you're writing a PowerPoint presentation, and you may have the same project and you'll probably be writing a PowerPoint presentation for that, it would be completely different than what you will be writing a Word report, which probably is going to go as a PDF to other people. It will, the report or the information presented in that particular piece would be completely different if you were writing a blog for a website, and it would be completely different if you were writing for an article for conversation or professional audience. Because why is it so? Because depending on the audience that we have, our language changes. And I think it is important to understand who your audience are, or sometimes pick your audience. And by picking your audience mean that if you're writing, for example, an academic article for a journal, and let's say you were talking about digital capabilities of healthcare professionals, which includes, you need to ask yourself who the healthcare professionals are, which will include doctors, nurses, allied health professionals, any other professions that you could think of, which will then allow you to see that, you know, if these people are going to access the article that you have, and if they do, then it will allow you to see what sort of audience they are, what sort of thinking they have, what kind of time and space would they have where they will be reading your article, and what kind of information would be useful for all of them, because then you are not presenting to a specific audience. If you were presenting only for doctors or only for nurses or only for AHPs, your writing would probably be different, because you will probably be using different examples according to the profession, which would make sense to them. Whereas if you have got a generic audience like this, you will be forced to think through examples which are understandable to all of those various different people and easier for them to engage with. Now, if you add patients or general public into that mix, the things become much more different, because now you will have to also cater to the needs of people who may not know that scientific knowledge that you have, the scientific terminology that you have, and therefore you will have to find a way to provide that information in a way which is acceptable and useful for all those different audiences. And I think that's where thinking through your audience is really important, because it just sets the tone. It just sets the way you are going to talk, the language you're going to use, the length of your article, and everything else. This is the reason that it is important for you to do that. No, you may pick your audience by profession or interest, and even if it's implicit, it's important, because if you look at the marketing disciplines, they usually create personas for marketing strategies where they want to try and assess that, you know, if they're developing a product, how that product would be useful and who will be the people using that particular product. So they basically think about social interest of those people, what those people look like in terms of their age, their demography, where they're living, what sort of interests they have, because that allows them to then develop marketing campaigns or to think through examples as to how they're going to reach them. The same is true when any product is developed, be it phone or anything else, because people think through all of those various different aspects to try and see how that information could be presented to the particular audience so that they're interested and towards the product, and the product sells quickly. And it's no different when it comes to healthcare or when it comes to writing, because we are writing it for consumer, and therefore it is important to do this. We often do not go through that kind of social profiling that I've just mentioned for marketing or product design aspects, but actually we do it. It's more of a mental exercise than a paper exercise. Would you agree with that? Would anyone want to add or change or suggest anything different? Richard, do you have any thoughts? Emma doesn't have microphone. Emma, please do introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your interest into the subject, even if it's by writing. And who else have joined? Paula, please do also tell us a little bit about yourself as well, if that's okay. So therefore, okay, does anyone want to say anything or add anything to it? So in terms of thinking through your audience, I think it's important that, you know, make a sort of just write it down as to who your audience are, because then that would allow you to ensure your language and everything else. But if you cannot write it on, do think about it. Who your audience are. Maybe it's by profession, maybe it's by interest, maybe it's by the problem that you're presenting, maybe it is by that, you know, people who are interested in learning about something, because that is important and that will shape the writing that you are going to have for that. You may also want to pick an age group and narrow your audience that way. So there are various different ways of narrowing the audience that you want to do, according to interest, according to profession, according to perhaps age, according to gender, according to depending on where you're going to submit your aspects. When we talk about audience, I think it is also where you are going to publish. It's also a means of understanding who your audience are. So for example, if it's an academic journal, let's say BMJ, so you know that BMJ is going to be read by healthcare professionals, mostly doctors, nurses and other healthcare professionals. So you will tone it in the sense that, you know, it is appropriate for those people. If you're writing a blog for a particular website, then you will think and tone it in a way that it needs to be done. If you're writing a blog for a younger age group, you will tone and write it in a way that is understandable to that particular group. So thinking through who you're writing it for at the start of the writing project is really important, because then that allows you to see where you're going. The next thing is, what is it for? Usually what I have seen in terms of when we look at the assignments or other aspects which students are presenting, the aim or the topic is not always clearly communicated. What is it that you want to achieve by presenting that information? What is the central message that you want to give to audience is not always thought through. And the same thing goes on if it is a journal article. For PhD students struggle with like research question, what the research question is and how do you articulate it for. And people, so that's again a fundamental concern which relates to who you're writing it for. So I think this is another thing that people need to understand. The purpose of the writing, the aim that you want to have, and the message that you want to convey. And usually I suggest that it's usually really useful to think through that particular purpose and write it down. And once you have written it down, it's easier to change it, adopt it, and make it slightly different, but at least it needs to be written. If it's not written, it becomes very difficult for people to then remember us, like who we were writing it for, unless you're a seasoned writer and you do it day in and day out. You cannot use the same sort of style and the same sort of approach for various different forms of writing. And this is one of the things which I see often, that when you ask people to, let's suppose if somebody has written a research article and you ask them to write a summary for laymen or a lay summary for different type of audience, they really struggle to think through and write that lay summary very, very clearly. Because they think that everybody understands the information that they have presented. As healthcare professional, I think we are guilty of understanding or thinking that everybody would have the same knowledge as myself, so therefore the information that we give it to them is understandable. But if you take a step back, it's not always easy to understand the information if you are not familiar with the subject, or if you are not going through that particular problem, or if you're not expert in that area. So therefore, it is important to understand what is the message that we want to give it to them, because then that allows you to see how you're going to frame it. Is it just for information? So are you just trying to convey information to somebody, and therefore the amount of information contained in the message would be very different? Is it for educational purposes? If it's for educational purposes, the idea and the way it is presented, it would be very different. Is it for entertainment purposes? And if it is, then how do you embed that particular idea that you wanted to convey into the message that you want to give it? Is it motivational? If it is motivational, then the type of examples or the type of things that you're going to choose and the tone of voice that you're going to choose would be very, very different. So therefore, it is important to understand what is it for and how you're going to convey that messages. So it will be useful to learn if any of you have got any examples of how you tackle this particular problem. Would anyone like to share anything? No? Richard, do you want to say something? Your microphone is on. That's the reason I'm asking you. I'm not picking on you.
I think it is difficult, and especially with healthcare stuff, because we have to remember that people who don't understand something are very likely to be unwilling to admit that and ask us to explain a term we've used or a word we've used. They're more likely to go away and try and look it up or ask somebody else later, which of course stops the whole of your message getting through because they're just not understanding it. And so that can be very difficult when it's a written thing that they may be only going to see for a short while, and you think they've understood it, and they may have understood it in their way, but it may be a complete misunderstanding. So I tend to feel that I tend to go into too much detail, and so I end up with something very long rather than something short and snappy. And often now, particularly with our sort of things like computer comments, they're a little bit like tweets. You've not actually got a limit necessarily in how many characters or how many words you use, but you've got to kind of keep it short because people haven't got time to read something really long. And I find that part of it a bit difficult.
Yeah, and it's quite it takes time. So you can't just kind of develop something of straight away to put a message on different mediums all at the same time. When I started using Twitter, I really struggled initially because within that particular characters, if you want to convey information, you have to write in a certain way. Over time, you develop that habit, but it's just not that easy. And if you're changing disciplines, so for example, Kate, you're talking about sociological sort of aspects. the way things are written in healthcare are very different the way things are written in sociology, and the way things are presented, and the use of sociological and the background knowledge which comes with it, the sociological theories and how things are explained. And I think if it is important to have that kind of background information and practice writing to be able to understand how is it that you're going to convey your message effectively. Again, it goes back to the aspects of the audience. So I have seen examples when people have written PhD theses, for example, and if they have gone to a wrong person who is not familiar with the kind of writing or the kind of tone of voice or the literature or the background theoretical information, they find it really difficult to understand. So you would find that a lot of you would see a comment that sociologists explain the problem in a very different way, and they talk about the problem and it causes and how it happens in a very different way than, for example, healthcare professionals. Most of them are usually solution oriented, so they cannot spend a lot of time on talking about the problems, but they are very quick and turning back and say, okay, fine, this is the problem, what is it that we are going to do about it? So I think that again then changes the dynamics, or the changes the tone of the message and everything else that you need to do. I think in doing so, when it comes to writing for academic journals, what I normally say is that people usually think that they are writing for their peers into like who are going to read eventually the aspects that they have written. But again, the level of scrutiny and the level of kind of, the process is such that you are actually writing it for very different audience all at the same time. So first of all, you're writing it for editors of the journal who are going to read through the information that you've presented, make their mind up if it's useful, if it's not useful. Is it going to go ahead? Is it written in a better way? Is it written appropriately? Is it making sense? And all the various other questions that they may have. And then they will pass it on to the next person. I think that probably is true for a lot of other sites. For example, if you're writing a blog for Conversation, I don't know if anyone have you written it, that probably is much more difficult. When you read the Conversation related article, it doesn't look very difficult. But if writing it takes a lot of time and effort. How many of you have read Conversation? The blog, or are you aware of? If not, I'll share with you and you can have a look at this. The idea behind it, Conversation blogs or articles, short articles, is that you have to convey the message within 500 words in a very easy to understand language, and do not use academic sort of language, but still convey the information from research to the lay audience. And on the surface, it looks really easy, but when you start writing it, you find that it has got a lot of scrutiny and it takes a lot more time than you actually think of. So editors are relevant at various different places depending on, and they help you shape your message according to the audience of that particular publication that you're writing it for. The next person that you need to think through is reviewers, because if the thing have passed from editors on, then it is going to go to peer reviewers, who are people in the community like yourself, and who would have the chance to read through the information that you have presented and make their mind up if it's useful, if it's not useful, if it's understandable, if it's correct, if it's not correct. So they will have a say on what you have written and how it is shaped. And this is where you will find that a lot of time, what you have presented in a particular journal article or a blog, submitted it to the site, and by the time you've got the reviewers' feedback, you've incorporated those feedbacks, it looks much different than what it was which you submitted at initially. And sometimes it probably is very different than what you have submitted or what you thought through this, because they have got influence on the way you write information and the way you present information. And finally is the audience that you're writing it for. So when it comes to writing for academic journals, my advice usually is that think through these 3 filtration processes and then make sure that you're able to write for all 3 of them and provide the information which all these 3 different people are going to look for. And thinking about audience and who you're writing it for actually makes you think about their needs and what they would be looking for if in that particular paper. And therefore, it will help you to put your message in a way which is understandable. The same is true. The same is true for for students. If you're writing it for your patients, for your academic journals, or sorry, if you're a student, you're writing it for lectures or for your degree aspects, and trying to take that information from there. And again, thinking through who you're writing it for is important. Thinking through what your marker is going to expect from the particular piece that you're writing is going to shape the way you write it. And I usually ask students to have a look at the marking criteria and to see what you've written, does that fit that sort of aspect, and how you can improve it. The same as if you're writing for journals or blogs or anything else. Look, if there is a criteria which they've provided you and with guiding you as to what it should look like, looking at that is really helpful, because then that helps you shape the information in a correct way, which is understandable to people. And my slides are stuck. Usually there are some form of non-ideal readers. They don't belong to your target group and they find your writing useful. So so there is a target group that you're writing it for, but then there would be other people who may not be completely interested in your writing, but they find your writing useful and they may read and they may have comments. And I think you have to think through of those readers as well when you're framing the messages. There is another group who is within your target group and who wants to read the information that you've written, but they might find your material useless, maybe because they don't agree with your point of view or the way it is presented, or they have got different reasons for it. And you have to think through these particular audience as well, so that you have provided information in a way that it attracts them. It gives the answers to the question that they might have. So it is, if I put that very simply, it is also about the readers who may have different ideas and what kind of questions would come into their mind. So when it comes to writing something, you do not only have to present the information that you want to present, but you need to think of the counter argument, the counter question which somebody is going to ask you, and how do you phrase or how do you present the information in a way that tackles those questions, because you're not there defending yourself, or you're not there presenting that information with your article. All that needs to be done through the piece that you have written. And finally, the third group is the one who don't belong to your reader, to your target group, and they don't find your material useless. And there is nothing much that you could do for that particular group. But the idea is that if you have things through the audience who are going to be interested into it, the audience who may be interested into in that particular target group, but may not agree with the point of view that you have or the message that you have, or the third group in itself. So therefore, thinking through all these types of reader would allow you to make sure that your written work is appropriate enough for various forms of readers, and you've made it interesting enough to do it. Now, writing usually takes less time, because if you have came to my previous workshops, we usually say that, write regularly, maybe 500 words or any particular target that you've given yourself to, and try and kind of, keep that kind of pace, because that helps you and improves your writing. Read a lot and all the rest of the stuff. So writing is one thing. So you have written, and the next biggest time that takes shape the writing and improve the writing is editing. So writing takes much lesser time, but it's the editing, looking back onto information, asking question yourself when you're reading through the information to see, does that convey the message that I wanted to convey? What if I am this type of reader who doesn't agree with the information? What kind of questions would they have in their mind? How do I answer and provide that information to the reader so that they are satisfied with it? How do I make it more clear to my readers? And that takes a lot of time, which means is putting it away, spending some time editing it, improving it, going back to it again, editing, improving it, asking somebody else to read it. So Kate earlier on suggested to share with peers or somebody else who is not interested in or is not the expert in your subject matter, asking them to read through the information and trying to incorporate that information is really useful. Taking up that feedback and making sure that that is included into it really helps improve the writing that you have done for whatever piece you're writing it for. So the idea behind this session was to talk about, like, as to why is it important to read through or think through the audience that you're writing it for, and how can you actually make sure, what are the strategies that you could do to ensure that you have cater the needs of various different audience that you have. So any one would like to share any other example or any other tip that they have used and they have found it really useful? A lot of people use somebody else like as peers to ask them to read through the information and find it usually helpful. A lot of people find it spending time on editing usually helpful. Any other tips? Any other anybody else have got any other suggestions or any other useful strategies which they have used, which they would like to share?
I think it helps to walk away from it and go back to it after you've sort of left it for a time period, and then go back and make sure it actually does say what you think it says, as opposed to what you think it says in your head. Because I think sometimes we can be very guilty of thinking that we've conveyed the right message, whereas actually it just says what we wanted it to say in our head, as opposed to actually when you read it again objectively, it maybe isn't quite, like you say, as concise and clear as we had hoped.
Definitely. And also it's like sometimes it's not only that, but the clarity of the message itself as well, because you've got a lot of information in your head, background information about that particular message, and the way you phrase it, you just think if it's clear to me, it's clear to everybody else. But people do not have that kind of background information that you already have. So taking a break and going back to the information and reading it as if it is written by somebody else really help identify those sorts of errors or those sorts of issues, and helps in making it much more clear. Yes, Paula, I really agree with that. That's a useful tip. Anybody else?
I think if you can, you need to also try and pass it by members of the group that's a target. Paul was in the same department as me, so we quite often end up sort of little meeting and convey the message between us all. But also you need to kind of include some examples of your target audience just to check that does it really say to them what we're trying to say.
Exactly. And sometimes that is, especially if you're sending a message, let's say on a Facebook page or something like that for a particular staff group or particular audience. And if you do not mention this, people can get quite lost as to what that information was or who is it for. So I think sometimes clarifying or stating your audience very, very clearly does help. And sometimes, you know, this concept of PPI, which is very patient and public involvement, which is very much prevalent in research, is all about that, isn't it? It is about that, you know, having that information and then going back to the group and asking them, is it making sense to you? And people who work with children, this is another example that sometimes we just think that information that we have presented it's probably too difficult for children to understand or too easy for children to understand. And I have seen that in my role with NHS Research Ethics Committee, that we as a committee have a look at the information and say, or as a researcher, that you look at the information and say, oh, well, maybe this group of children would find it really difficult to understand. And once you go into that particular group, it actually surprises you, because they may have better knowledge that you thought, or they may have slightly different type of questions and would like that information to be presented really differently. So going to the target group and asking them to read through the information and giving you some feedback is always really helpful. Thank you. Do you have any examples, Sarah?
Well, I was actually thinking from a blog that's set up for NHS libraries in the North that I'm on the editorial group for. And we take all comers, but then we try and help the author mould their piece. So so that they can present it in their own authentic voice, but that it's actually coherent. And so it's a bit of a, we don't have particular set of rules for that. It's just we'll take what we're sent and we'll try and help them mold it. But it can be that, as you were saying, that a person writes their piece and they have an awful lot of knowledge in their head that helps them interpret what they've written and understand what they've meant, and it's completely absent if you don't have that background knowledge. And it's trying to fill the gaps in so that everyone can understand it at a first reading, I guess.
So I think the nutshell, I mean, I know, Emma, your microphone is not working, so please, you're welcome to please share your thoughts on the on the chat if you like. So I think the message from this particular session is thinking through your audience, thinking about your audience, who you're writing it for, and thinking about the message that you want to convey to the audience is really important and shapes the piece that you're writing it for. And that's usually the first thing which I suggest people should do when they're thinking about writing something. What is the message that you want to convey, and who is it that you want to convey it to, and why would they find it useful? So if you've articulated these three aspects or have written them in bold, like at the start of the document, it just helps you then to make sure that the piece which is written is conveying those messages and it's giving that information. And rest of the stuff is like editing, spending more time onto the written material, trying to kind of, asking somebody else to read it for you, giving feedback. All of that helps shape, improve, and kind of, improve the quality of the write-up and makes it better. But if you don't have those 2 or 3 aspects thought through earlier on, no matter how much time you're going to spend on writing something, it still is not going to be effective. So having those 3 things at the start really, really help develop a good quality piece, and rest of the strategies will then help improve the quality of the aspects and the quality of the message and how you convey it to your audience. So take your time in writing, and I'm happy to take any comments or questions. I've deliberately tried to keep it kind of, shorter, because with this type of session, you never know sure if you're meeting the needs of the people who have joined the session and if they have any other questions. So please, by all means, ask any questions which I can give you. I can try and answer, or we all can help each other try and kind of answer, and we can just take it on from there. So any questions or comments?
With the sort of writing to patients and such like, at one stage the trust had a sort of recommendation that you had to imagine a particular reading age for your target audience. I think they'd set it at 7 years old. I just wonder how relevant that really is these days. That, sort of is that
I think the health literacy, the reading age of the majority of adults in the country is much, much lower than, than well-educated people would assume. And last time I read something like that, it was an 11-year-old was a very typical adult reading and comprehension age. So 7 may be a little low, but it's not a tremendous amount higher. It's certainly not across the board as if everyone has finished secondary school.
Yes, it is true. And I think there are different websites which can help you look at the readability scores, especially the information, as you were saying, Richard, which is going to patient-facing information or general public-related information. It's good to check the readability score of that particular information to try and see if there are words that needs to be changed or improved so that it is accessible to everybody. Usually that is used when you're writing, as you're saying, leaflets or patient-related information sheets for research studies, or any other information where we are trying to present it to wider public related audience. So it still is true, but what Sarah is saying is probably right. I don't remember what exactly the age is now, but there are websites and there are aspects which can help, survey what you've written, scan the text that you've written, and can give you alternatives for aspects that you've written. And I think a lot of blogs that people write would also benefit from those aspects, and especially the one I was mentioning conversations. If you write a blog in Conversation on any particular topic, they do go through the readability statistics to try and see, is it readable to wider audience or not?
I mean, it is a really good point, and it's a perfect storm in areas of high deprivation, because that tends to be high health needs and low educational attainment, and all of that means that the patients are not necessarily understanding at a level that that you'd hope that they would when you're giving them written information.
And also, people come from various different backgrounds, and people may have the different ability to understand English. And sometimes when people have used jargons, or people have used idioms, or the way of kind of, common phrases that people do not necessarily kind of in a multicultural society do not understand that. So the message can be completely misinterpreted. So that's where readability statistics and those aspects can help make sure that, the message is given in a way which is understood by most people. I think you can still, there would be chances of errors and some people misinterpreting it, but at least you've got a wider range of audiences who understand the information.
I've got a little bit of experience of that because we've been hosting a couple of Ukrainian families. And so we're kind of used to the idea of having people using their phone to do the translation so that a conversation can be understood. And it's quite amusing that. But we've now got to the stage where the kids are correcting the mother when she doesn't speak perfect English and gets her words in the wrong order in a sentence. Remembering you might be having to deal with people in second or even third languages is not something most of us are very good at, and I think I was useless at that to begin with. They couldn't understand me at all, but they could understand my wife. So
exactly. And see, I write in English regularly. I edit a journal and everything else, but my children, the way they say things, or sometimes they correct you for. And the other thing is, I think we all have probably experienced that it's not only if English is your first language, not, it's a generational thing as well. Like things which are said in a certain way or written in a certain way in one generation are completely different than how they're done in the next generation. I don't know if anyone has experienced that.
I guess you see that a lot in the blogs and things like that, don't you? And some of the difference with TikTok and normal English, if I can put it that way, is at least that way, isn't it? It's the generational differences.
Yes, and that may, and I think for me, a very eye-opening exercise was a couple of years back. I did a review of it was 40th anniversary of a journal. So we were looking at the articles which were published in the last 40 years in that particular journal around patient safety or something. And I was reviewing those articles, and I could see how the language has changed from kind of, from start of the journal 40 years ago and throughout that period. And you can actually kind of look at the information presented 40 years, you just think, my God, you don't write it like that today. So that's when I realized that as the time passes, because it's just so subtle and we just go through it, we don't often recognize it. But those sorts of aspects would also make it different, and how the newer generation would want to see the information presented is much different than how we did it in 20-30 years ago. And in a way we sleepwalk into it. So I think those sorts of stopping and asking people to read through the information for you, giving you feedback and all that aspects does help a lot in terms of making sure that the writing is current and useful. So that was interesting. Thank you. Any other question, anybody else? I'll stop sharing. And if you have got any questions, if you'd like to contact us by email address and Twitter handle, and Sarah is going to put her address into the chat box, please do get in touch with us. If you're writing something and if you think we can help you, I don't know, by reviewing it, reading it, or giving you some feedback, we'll be more than happy to try and help or signpost you to appropriate sources, if you like.
I'm just about to post the our survey link as well, so we could have some feedback on today's workshop. and any ideas for future ones. If you just take a couple of minutes, that would be marvelous.
And we did this session for the very first time, so I'm not entirely sure if that met the, what else would you have liked in that kind of session. So please do give us any feedback as to what other information would have been useful, how else we could have made this better, or did it meet your expectations or not. So thank you so much for attending, and please do fill in your feedback form. It really helps. So I'll stop live streaming, and thank you everybody for joining us.